What is it then that inexorably tips the scales in favor of the extraordinary, an irrational factor that destines a man to emancipate himself from the herd and from its well-worn paths? The fact that many a man who goes his own way ends in ruin means nothing. He must obey his own law as if it were a daemon whispering to him of new and wonderful paths. What does it really mean to grow psychologically and spiritually? It's a basic core question that's at the heart of any philosophical and spiritual investigation, yet it's an incredibly intimidating one. It's one that I've shied away from, really, because though we've never had more techniques and philosophies and information at our disposal, we are absolutely collectively spiritually listless and decontextualized, as I've pointed out many times. So that makes even addressing this question in an intelligent way that we can all get behind really intimidating. And although we're decades and decades removed from his life, one of my biggest philosophical influences, Carl Jung, knew this was the case. And his complex, multifaceted answer to that question is what he called individuation, a lifelong psychospiritual maturation process. A process of accumulating wisdom, investigating the psyche, and integrating its unconscious elements so that we can become more whole, more complete individuals. Or in Jung's own words, the psychological process that makes a human being an individual, a unique, indivisible unit or whole man. And in typical Jungian fashion, that makes conceptual sense, but it's difficult to really wrap your mind around. What does it really mean? Individuation goes to the heart of what spirituality is, what spirituality even means, and what our spiritual imperative is as individual humans. In this transmission, my friends, we will attempt to answer those questions, and I think we're going to fundamentally alter your idea of who you are and what it means to have a well-lived, purposeful life. So what is individuation? What are its origins? To answer this question, we actually have to get pretty esoteric right off the bat, because the idea of individuation actually seems to have originated in what is arguably Jung's most esoteric text, a text so esoteric that he didn't even put his name on it originally. He originally ascribed it to the Gnostic sage Basilides. More on him a bit later, but this text was called Seven Sermons to the Dead, and today you'll find it as part of Jung's absolutely mind-blowing mythopoetic masterpiece, The Red Book. In the text, which really does read like a channeled, sagely work, it's all written from the perspective of Jung's wise old man, or Senex, archetype, a figure he called Philemon. In the following passage, Philemon lays out really the origin of Jung's idea of individuation. And again, just to set the context, this is a dreamlike, visionary oration given by essentially an enlightened being that knows the secrets of life and death. What is the harm, ye ask, in not distinguishing oneself? If we do not distinguish, we get beyond our own nature, away from creatura. We fall into indistinctiveness, which is the other quality of the pleroma. We fall into the pleroma itself and cease to be creatures. We are given over to disillusion in the nothingness. This is the death of the creature. Therefore we die in such measure as we do not distinguish. Hence the natural striving of the creature goeth towards distinctiveness, fighteth against primeval perilous sameness. This is called the principium individuationis. This principium individuationis, this is individuation. So we can see here already that this is more than just a concept of psychological development for Jung. This goes to some very spiritual, visionary depths. This is the spiritual goal of the individual. In this passage, Philemon is saying that if we do not discover our own nature and live it via our own individuation process, we're going to fall into indistinction, into nothing, merge back into the pleroma. And I'm sure many of you are wondering, what the hell is pleroma? Well, pleroma is a Greek word that literally translates to fullness. It's a concept largely discussed by Gnostics that means total, complete unity, a divine oneness that is essentially the opposite of the individual. Now, at first, to me, merging back with divine unity doesn't seem all that bad. But if we do get swallowed up by the pleroma, we cease to be individuals. We miss our opportunity to individuate. And this is a problem because if we fail to individuate to reach our own unique fullness, we have essentially failed the plan of nature, Jung believed. We sort of become psychospiritually stillborn. Again, as that earlier quote said, we are given over to disillusion in the nothingness. This is the death of the creature. So this is the origin of individuation. As I said, pretty mystical, esoteric stuff, not particularly psychological or practical, at least at first glance. So let's cleanse our palates on that point and get in to the practical, psychological elements of individuation. I want to point out that for what follows, I owe a huge debt to the Jungian analyst and author Murray Stein. Stein explores individuation really thoroughly in his collected works, and I highly recommend it for a more advanced, nuanced exploration. As Stein points out, one of the most influential frameworks for understanding the practical side of individuation comes from Erich Neumann. Neumann breaks individuation down into 3 stages: the containment nurturant stage, or the matriarchal stage, the adapting adjusting stage, the paternal or patriarchal, and the centering integrating stage, the individual stage. So first, we have the nurturant stage, the matriarchal stage. This is the phase that maps over the first part of human development, and it makes sense, right? Life literally begins inside the mother's womb. You are taken care of, you are protected. You are fully reliant on the mother. But childhood in general is also part of this stage because childhood at least tends to be this supportive, nerfed time of life where you're protected, where you have your needs met. And this is symbolically and mythologically typified by the Garden of Eden, where again we are protected. We're blissfully ignorant also. The child's mind is really psychologically fused with the mother's mind to an extent. And this psychological fusion between the child and the mother, Jung refers to this as participation mystique. Whip that one out next time you want to intellectually flex on someone. Eventually, though, that psychological fusion between the mother and child begins to break down, and we also begin to test the limits of that protective bubble. We begin to understand we have preferences of our own. We start to solidify an ego. And in centuries past, there was a strict demarcation, a kind of second birth that occurred at the end of this stage in the form of initiation. This is typically what happened in tribal cultures. There was a initiation ritual that demarked becoming a man or a woman. Of course, in modern life, that line is significantly blurrier. In fact, many of us get caught up into that first stage, that matriarchal stage, into our 20s or even 30s. And mothers themselves can also bear a significant amount of the guilt for this happening. This is what's known as the devouring mother archetype, where essentially an overbearing mother keeps you trapped in that womb, won't let you leave that protective bubble. That said, the vast majority of us do move on to phase 2, and this again is the patriarchal stage, or the adapting, adjusting stage. This is the stage where you get super pissed off at the patriarchy. Bad joke. But actually, that sort of could be part of the stage because it does involve solidifying your own identity, your own opinions. This phase is more symbolically patriarchal because this is the time where we're mature enough to live in the real world. And this is the quote-unquote patriarchal world because it's the realm of competition, the realm of consequences, the realm of really understanding that the world doesn't revolve around you and that you have to work hard if you want to distinguish yourself. You have to work hard if you want to gain status. So life is no longer ideal, it's realistic. We have to gain skills, we have to develop an ego capable of making its own way in the world, because it is going to collide with the harsh realities of life, and we don't want it to crumble at the first sign of resistance. So this is the time of reality checks, like I said, of consequences. We're going to find out the hard way that that girl we're infatuated with doesn't like us back, that we're not going to get the job we want just because we want it. This stage is really typified, Stein notes, by the archetype of the hero. We have to find that heroic energy in ourselves if we want to thrive in this state, even to an extent if we just want to leave the comfortable matriarchal bubble from phase 1, we've got to locate this energy. Another important element of this stage is that this is where psychological issues can develop. This is where neuroses can begin to show up. Because of the difficulties of this stage, we might develop narcissism because we long to be appreciated in the way that we were in phase 1 by our families. Stein also mentions borderline personality disorder and a couple of other common pathologies, all of which emerge because of, or in part because we've failed to get on top of that energy of the heroic, of finding our way in life. And of course that's oversimplified, but you see what I'm getting at. Now, if we do manage to settle into the second phase, we will eventually begin to feel the call of the third stage. And that transition from phase 2 to phase 3 is where things get really interesting, because we begin to become concerned with something new. We begin to find that being fed by outer success no longer really satisfies us. We go from a largely ego-based style of growth to a desire for something psychospiritual that we can't quite put our fingers on. And this brings us to the final stage, the most interesting stage of individuation, the individual stage, or the centering stage, the integrating stage. As Jung said, he whose desire turns away from outer things reaches the place of soul. This is really the stage that sets individuation apart from other psychological development models, because after all, what's left for us to do? We're physically and neurologically fully developed at this point. In fact, from the outside looking in, we've really peaked. We're degrading with age, we're getting impotent. But of course, Jung rejected this idea. He believed that although, yes, of course, we are fully physically and neurologically developed, maturation continues in very important ways, primarily psychospiritual ways, but only if we do the right things. And what are those right things? Well, it begins with what Jung calls an inward turn. As I said at the beginning of this section with that quote, he whose desire turns away from outer things reaches the place of the soul. This is the kind of inward turn we need to do. Of course, it's easier than ever to mistake that call or completely ignore that call. I'll start with the former. It's easier to mistake that impulse for a call to deepen what we're doing on the outside, become more successful on the outside, hoard more material, more money, more status, or to ignore by living in a comfortable, complacent bubble, in a kind of state of denial about the fact that we're headed toward death for as long as possible. But if we do make that cryptic inward turn and really enter that third stage of individuation, this is when our souls begin to flower. As the name suggests, this stage is aimed toward becoming a centered, whole individual, a person who has explored and integrated their psyche as extensively as possible so that they can become a truly unique individual. And as we talked about at the beginning of this transmission, this is an individual who is related to both the physical and practical, the earthly and the transcendent. Of course, this inward turn ideally would be guided by the skilled hand of a Jungian analyst, and you would formally do things like dream analysis and active imagination. But in this video, we're going to stay broad, but fear not, we will return to those topics specifically in future transmissions. The first step, according to Stein, is to investigate the persona and the ego and see them for what they are. Not our totality, just constructs that live on the outside, the outer bubble of our much larger, much deeper, more oceanic psyche. But really at every turn, we're met here with something murky, because what does that even mean? After all, up to this point in life, that's really all we've had. We have this nebulous realm of our thoughts, then we have who it seems like we really are on the outside, and that's our ego and our persona. How do we even begin to dive deeper. We know that we're no longer satisfied by our collective identity. You know, Aiden, the lawyer, Caden, the bike messenger, Jaden, the accountant, but we don't know what to do about it. We don't know how to go deeper. As many of you know, I quit my day job a little over a year ago. That's not always the answer. I want to be very clear about that. But we do have to go beyond our desires for external approval, approval from authority figures in general, and become more concerned with a kind of inner approval, a way of living that harmonizes with us at the deepest level of our own psyches, in accordance with what Jung called the capital S self. You gotta develop that sigma energy. As Jung says, it is death to the soul to become unconscious. People die before there is death of the body because there is a death of the soul. And talking about this is challenging because it's not enough to intellectually decide that we want to go to the deeper parts of our psyches or go beneath the ego, see the persona for what it is. Also, that's really just the beginning of the challenges because, as Stein points out, this third stage is often catalyzed by hard times in life. Depression, midlife crisis, tragedies. Unfortunately, this is the part of life where family members might start dying. Such things tend to make those existential questions and desires so intense that we have no choice but to address them or probably have a breakdown. So this is where inner work of some kind really becomes of paramount importance, because if you want to go your own way, that's what you need to do. You need to go deeper within the self. And I know that that's murky, but as Jung said, if the path before you is clear, you're probably on someone else's. Now, when we do make that inward turn, no matter how we get there, whether it's through the portal of hard times or just deciding we want to do that inner work, and we begin to see our persona and the ego for what they are, and we start to look into the oceanic depths of the psyche, the next thing that happens is a confrontation with archetypes. For more on archetypes and what they are, check out my video on the topic here. But broadly speaking, archetypes exist in the deepest part of the unconscious, what Jung called the collective unconscious, a sort of invisible psychic underground that we're connected to but can't see into directly, that's shared by all of humanity. The collective unconscious, as well as the personal unconscious, is a realm of symbol, and the most powerful symbols are archetypes. These are primordial locuses of energy that represent universal inherited ideas or patterns of thought that are shared by human beings across time and across the globe. One of the easiest examples of this to see are primordial god images and mythological images and motifs. I don't mean to gloss over this because this really is a gigantic, powerful idea. The idea that archetypes are very real, they're very alive, they really are influencing you is an epiphany in and of itself. When we break open the psyche, their energy rises to the surface, and as Stein notes, they often offer our persona a new identity. But this too is antithetical to individuation because archetypes do not offer us uniqueness. They do not offer us individuality. In fact, one of the things they offer us is ego inflation, or what Jung called the mana personality. You know, think of the stereotypical person who goes looking for themselves. They have one plant medicine experience or go on one meditation retreat and they think they're a shaman. Or even more cliche, they blow up their life by having an affair, or they blow all their money on a Ferrari or something. And to be clear, there's nothing wrong with committing to a spiritual path or finding a better relationship or even driving a cooler car. But oftentimes these things end up being not about individuation, about truly becoming unique, but rather they become ways to create a new archetypally enhanced persona. That said, individuation may, and honestly probably will, destabilize your life. It certainly did for Jung. As many of you know, he was poised to inherit Freud's intellectual and professional legacy, but he knew that Freud's position, Freud's philosophies did not harmonize with his own. And this resulted in him not only parting with Freud, but vacating a bunch of prestigious positions at Zurich University as the first president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. And this is really what ultimately catalyzed Jung's own inward turn, because his outer identity was essentially destroyed. He had to recreate himself with a deeper, stronger psychospiritual foundation. His own soul searching led him to directly communicate with archetypes and almost go completely mad in the process, but he ultimately was able to channel it into his mythopoetic masterpiece, the Red Book, and develop his own psychoanalytic theory. So Jung dove into the thrashing waters of his psyche, but he was able to not only hold on to his individuality, but really make his own individuality, find his soul, as he put it. Or as he puts it in this quote, the individual stands, as it were, between the conscious part of the collective psyche and the unconscious part. He is the reflecting surface in which the world of consciousness can perceive its own unconscious. Accordingly, the individual would be a point of intersection or a dividing line. So we can't allow the collective psyche to swallow us up. We have to take all of that unconscious content, find a way to make it conscious, but also maintain our individuality, serve as a kind of point in the center between the two, contextualize the two. So both Jung and Stein make it clear that without finding that kind of perspective, without undergoing such initiations, we really don't become who we are. We don't even see the world clearly because those unconscious parts of our own psyche remain hidden, and we just mindlessly project them onto the outside world, which distorts it, which keeps us in a mental matrix constructed by our own unconscious, our own shadow. This is all exemplified by what Jung called the transcendent function. The transcendent function arises from the union of conscious and unconscious content, and thus creates a clearer, more complete picture of the psyche and of the individual. Speaking of clarity, I know that wasn't clear because, like so many of Jung's concepts, you can understand it intellectually, but it's a little difficult to bring down to earth, to bring down to the firmament of your own psyche and your own practical experience. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So what are those moments of merging between conscious and unconscious like? One of the examples that I just thought of for some reason is when you finally have that realization that your parents aren't just your parents. They're actual, regular, flawed, beautiful human beings that have had all of the life experiences you've had in their own unique way. Or you meet someone and you become hugely infatuated with them, you develop a huge crush on them, and it's like you're under a spell. But then after a while that wears off and you become, again, more conscious of who they really are, of all of their flaws, of their full humanity. These are moments where the unconscious and all of our projections suddenly transmute into reality, into a new, fuller understanding. These are kind of mild versions of what Jung is talking about with that transcendent function. But the transcendent function goes beyond that. It goes to the deepest parts of our own psyche and our own souls. And speaking of interconnection between the unconscious and the conscious, Stein also notes that in phase 3, a lot of spooky things tend to occur. This tends to be a thing that kind of manifests synchronicity or attracts synchronicity or strange precognitive dreams, as it did so famously in Jung's own cases. I talk about a lot of them in my synchronicity videos if you want to check those out. Stein concludes his exploration of the 3 phases of individuation with a really important quote that I want to read part of. And the quote speaks to the difference between individualism and individuation. Quote, individualism often ends up being a kind of narcissism centered on the importance of the ego. Individuation, on the other hand, includes a large amount of ego development, but it goes on to include and integrate the polarities and complexes within and without. It does not ignore the importance of altruism and relationship, but rather includes these elements centrally in its program. It fosters both self-regard and broad social interest in that it focuses on the capital S self, not the ego. Even at this point, we've covered so much ground, we could probably conclude our exploration of individuation here, but there are some deep, soul-animating questions and topics remaining, and you know that I can't resist that esoteric goodness. First, a question. What is really happening when we individuate, and what is really the goal? My reading of Jung and Stein and numerous other people on that philosophical tree leads me to a pretty strong conclusion. As I alluded to in the beginning with 7 Sermons to the Dead, this is not just about psychological growth, at least in the way that we typically think about it, but a spiritual blooming, a blooming that may even go beyond our physical lives. This is clearly what Jung, or whatever was speaking through Jung, was trying to communicate in that aforementioned mystical text, 7 Sermons to the Dead, that if the individual reaches their full potential, they're kind of reborn. They're reborn into the realm of soul. And don't take it from me, here's a quote from Jung. The soul has its own peculiar world. Only the self enters in there, or the man who has completely become his self. He who is neither in events, nor in men, nor in his thoughts. Now, this is where we need to return to the origin of individuation, to 7 Sermons to the Dead. And this is where I get so intrigued. And I think I'm going to intrigue a lot of you and probably lose some of you. But again, this text that we talked about at the beginning, the 7 Sermons to the Dead that Jung attributed to the Gnostic sage Basilides, this was clearly an incredibly important work to Jung. So important that he published this book pseudonymously while the rest of his famous Red Book that he slaved away at for years sat locked away. In fact, as many of you know, the Red Book itself sat locked up for decades after his death. It was not released until 2009. What was it that made 7 Sermons to the Dead so important to Jung? Why did he publish only this piece of what later became the Red Book and do something as strange as attribute it to Basilides? I think it's because he believed this was of deep spiritual importance, that humanity was collectively hugely astray, and we needed a route to return to the deepest spiritual fiber of our being, that we must navigate that murky labyrinth of spiritual longing. Here are some particularly soul-stirring quotes from 7 Sermons in the Red Book that illustrate that. Quote, "Just as you become part of the manifold essence of the world through your bodies, so you become a part of the manifold essence of the inner world through your soul. Man is a gateway through which you must pass from the outer world of gods, daimons, and souls into the inner world. The dead who besiege us are the souls who have not fulfilled the principium individuationis, or they would have become distant stars. Insofar as we do not fulfill it, the dead have a claim on us." So these quotes demonstrate a need for a kind of spiritual rebirth. A rebirth that I really don't think can even be fully contained in the confines of psychology alone. And again, don't take it from me. Take it from Jung's closest collaborator over multiple decades, Mary Louise von Franz. Quote, "The basis and substance of Jung's entire life and work do not lie in the traditions and religions which have become contents of the collective conscious, but rather in the primordial experience which is the source of these contents, the encounter of the single individual with his own god or daimon, his struggle with the emotions, effects, fantasies, and creative inspirations and obstacles which come to light from within." So it's really to travel this path of transformation, yes, psychologically, but also spiritually, psycho-spiritually, not in a expressly religious way, but in a mystical one, for sure. One that does, as she says in that quote, require an encounter of the single individual with his own God. This, my friends, is the true meaning of individuation at its deepest root. And I could absolutely go on about how I think this overlaps with various esoteric and mystical traditions, both Eastern and Western. Hermeticism, Gnosticism, Platonism. And Jung is clearly pulling from those wells elsewhere in his collected works. But I'm going to have to save that exploration for a future transmission, my friends, because I don't know where this one is going to land by the time I finish the edit, but I know it's going to be absolutely massively busting. But I do want to leave you with some parting questions. Do you feel this inward call, the call to individuate? What things in your life are blocking you from that individuation? Are you struggling with that inward turn? Let me know in the comments. I would love for you to all speak to one another. On that note, leaving comments does help, but tickling the algorithm in all ways does greatly help. That means like, subscribe, comment, share, do all the things. And if you want to support these transmissions directly and talk to me and hundreds of other Wonder Dippers actually, join us over at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. We've got a patron-only Discord server. We do Zoom hangs. We have a book club. You get rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more. I also have a podcast with over 300 episodes. A lot of that back catalog only exists on podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple Pods. Of course, we do have many mind melts posted here in full ocular glory here on YouTube as well. That's going to conclude this transmission. Much love to all of you. See you in the next one.